Well, we're on video number 3 about the Kick75, so it's fitting that I have 3 Kick75s here. This might be the last one, at least for a while. I finally got my hands on the NuPhy IO version of the Kick75, and I also got more of these switches to test out. So we're going to take a look at the differences between the QMK version and the NuPhy IO version, and of course, we'll do a bunch more sound tests. Alright, this disclaimer is more complicated than usual. NuPhy sent me one Kick75 to review back before it was released. That's the QMK version. Here, they also sent me a conversion kit to swap it between low and high profile. I purchased both of the NuPhy IO versions here myself and all of the other switches that I've tested, and that may sound crazy, but I do want to keep one for myself, and I wanted to give away one of each. So yes, I'll be giving away 2 of these. I will post giveaway info in the comments. Sorry if you're watching this later after the giveaway is over. So as always, I was not paid to make this video, and NuPhy has no input on my review or any comments that I'm gonna make about the Kick75. I do have some affiliate links in the description for you if you're interested in picking up anything and you wanna support this channel. Okay, so what I've got for sound tests is, of course, both the QMK and NuPhy IO versions of the keyboard, which you may assume sound identical, but they do have different batteries and thus maybe slightly different internal arrangements, so do pay attention to whether they sound the same. And for switches, I now have tested both the Nano version and the Max version of the brown, red, and blush switches. The only one I have not tested is the silver switch. So let's run through these sound tests, and then instead of another full rundown of features and specs of the Kick75, we're gonna go right into discussing the differences between the firmware versions and my overall assessment of the Kick75. Now, if you do want a full rundown of all the specs and features and everything, then check out my full review video, which I will link to in the description and up in the corner of this video. Okay, now let's talk about what's different between the NuPhy IO version and the QMK version of the Kick75. Of course, the obvious difference is that because the firmware is different, the way you customize them is also going to be different. The QMK version can be customized using VIA, while the NuPhy IO version uses the NuPhy IO web app. Now, in practice, NuPhy IO was designed to actually work very similarly to VIA when it comes to the remapping and the macro creation features. It's basically just clicking on keys you want to remap and then selecting the functions you want to assign. You have 4 layers to work with in both the Windows and Mac profiles, which are kept separate from each other, and you record and assign your macros in any layer. NuPhy IO keeps the OS modes separate, like I said, and the QMK version has the OS modes just built into one key map as different layers in that key map, if that makes sense. So with VIA, you see all of the layers, including the Mac mode layer and the Windows mode layer, whereas in NuPhy IO, those are like controlled at a higher level. You go into the Mac mode where you have 4 layers, you go into the Windows mode where you have 4 layers. So just a little difference there in terms of how you navigate your remapping. Now with VIA, you have the same basic abilities as NuPhy IO, but there are a couple of differences in the kind of experience. When you first open VIA and give the permission to connect to your Kick75, there's a chance that nothing will happen. Now this is just something that happens sometimes with VIA and QMK keyboards. You may need to download the base keymap file and load it into VIA in order for it to actually work. It's not a big deal, and NuPhy has a page on their site where you can download the file, but for someone new to VIA and QMK in general, that can definitely be confusing. You could think it's broken and not working. When it comes to the available pre-made key functions, there are some in NuPhy IO that are not in the QMK version. For example, if you go into the Media Control Functions tab in the key binding screen, you'll find some custom functions for Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator, and Figma that you can assign to keys as well as to the encoder knob. And that is one of the key differences between these versions. You cannot remap the encoder knob in the QMK version. It's just going to be volume up and down and mute. You can't go in and edit that. With the NuPhy IO version, you do have access to edit the encoder knob function. So you can do things like change it to mouse scrolling left and right, zoom functions, and you can use those Adobe functions that I mentioned. So you have more options for the encoder knob with the NuPhy IO version. Another difference is in the lighting control. In the NuPhy IO version, you basically just have a better interface for controlling the RGB lighting modes as well as the side light mode, including picking a custom color. Now, the Kick75 doesn't have per key control for the backlight in either version, meaning you can't select individual keys and assign different colors. I think, however, that could be a possible update in the firmware with the NuPhy IO version. Since it's their firmware, they control it. So there's a chance that maybe they could push that as a firmware update. Speaking of firmware updating, doing that is another difference. When you open NuPhy IO with your keyboard connected, it's actually going to give you a pop-up to prompt you and let you know there's a new firmware version available, and flashing that update is very simple. You basically just click a button and it will run the firmware update. It'll push it to your keyboard, then you turn the keyboard off and back on, and you're good to go. Now, to update the firmware on the QMK version, you need to download the firmware file from NuPhy's website first, and then you need to actually download and install QMK Toolbox, which is a separate program, and that's what you're going to use to flash the update to your keyboard. So updating the firmware in the QMK version is a little more complicated, and also updating the firmware to the 2.4 gigahertz receiver, because that has its own separate firmware. That's also more complicated, whereas it's just easier with NuPhy IO. Now, if I've made it sound like the QMK version is the worst version here, well, the appeal of QMK is not simplicity. It's that you can actually get into the code and see it and edit it for yourself if you want to. It's not a proprietary locked down firmware that you cannot access, which NuPhy IO is. All right, continuing with differences, we have a couple physical things to point out. First, check out the 2.4 gigahertz dongle. The NuPhy IO version is smaller and comes installed in the little slot next to the USB-C port on the back of the Kick75. I personally love built-in storage for these receivers because if I'm not using it, it's always got a place where it belongs versus being loose in the box or loose in a desk drawer. With the QMK version, it's a larger receiver that actually doesn't totally fit in that storage slot. It comes with a little silicone plug installed and the receiver is separate in the box. I'm honestly not sure why it has to be different, but it's different. Another physical difference is on the inside. As I mentioned earlier, it's the battery. The NuPhy IO version has a 2500 milliamp hour battery, which NuPhy estimates to have 360 hours of use time with all the lighting turned off. I'm assuming that's also in Bluetooth mode because Bluetooth uses a little less power. The QMK version has a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, and NuPhy does not provide a separate estimated use time for that version on their website. I personally have not noticed any significant difference in the battery life with the QMK version with the lighting turned off using the Bluetooth mode. I used it straight for a couple of weeks on a daily basis without needing to recharge, and the battery level indicator hadn't turned red yet, so I haven't, in real world, haven't experienced much of a difference there. Now, the reason for the difference in the battery capacities is that QMK firmware is not very power efficient. I'm not sure what firmware NuPhy IO is based on, but it's obviously more power efficient than QMK because that version still gets a considerable battery life with a 37% smaller battery. Now again, if you're looking for a breakdown of all the physical specs between the low and high profile versions, check out the full review that I mentioned earlier. Again, link is in the description. One other very minor thing that I'm just gonna point out, this actually doesn't have to do with the different firmware versions, but the low and high profile version, I didn't know this until I got one, but actually the high profile version, which I'll hold up here, has a very slightly different color to the white keycaps. If you just look at the color shading of the white between the high profile keycaps and the low profile keycaps here, the white ones are more bright white, and it makes the high profile ones look a little bit duller white, I guess you could say. You're obviously not gonna notice that if you just buy one version and you never swap between low and high profile, but I'm just pointing it out just in case. I have no idea why that would ever be relevant, but I did notice a very slight difference there in the white shade between low and high profile keycaps. All right, now let's talk about the different switch options that I've tested now and also my overall assessment of the Kick75 now that I've used both versions. Let's begin with the red switches. Both the low profile and high profile versions have the classic 45 gram actuation force for a red switch, but they are slightly heavier on the bottom out force than a traditional red switch. The low profile red is 60 grams and the high profile red max is 58 grams. The low profile red is all palm and the red max has a palm top, PA66 bottom, and LY stem. Now that's not unique to the red switch. The only switch in the series that actually has the same construction materials for both the low and high profile option is the blush switch. Otherwise, the red, brown, and silver all have some differences in materials between the low and high profile switch. Now getting back to my opinion on the red switches, I've got the reds actually in both the low and high profile here. I like the reds better in the low profile version personally. The red Nano has a nice consistent lube on the batch that I have. They're not scratchy at all. They have very, very minimal wobble, and the sound is nice and marbly, but not too loud. The red Max, on the other hand, well, they also had good consistent lube on the batch that I received, but they have a bit more wobble, and they were kind of my least favorite in terms of the sound profile. There's nothing wrong with it if you like it, but they're the loudest overall to my ear, and they also seem to create this little bit of a hollow sound, like they bring out a little bit more of a hollow sound in the Kick75. They're definitely far from the worst red type switch that I've used. They're just not my favorite out of the options available for the Kick75, except for the red Nano version. I do actually like those. Now next we have the brown Nano and Max switches. Again, I liked the Nano version actually better than the Max version, but the margin was smaller here. They're pretty close to, for me anyway. Both low and high profile have an actuation force of 50 grams and a bottom out force of 65 grams. And again, their materials are different just like the red switches. Now the Nano switch has such a mild tactile bump that when NuPhy originally sent me the Kick75 with those in there, I thought they might actually be linear switches. They're more mild than any low profile tactile switch I have used before, and I actually really liked it after I got used to it. They also have a nice deep sound that I really enjoyed. Now the brown Max switch feels to me more like a traditional brown switch, just with a thockier, a deeper sound profile than what you would get out of like a Gatoron brown switch. I personally prefer the sound of the brown Max over the red Max because I didn't find it to bring out as much of that hollow sound in the keyboard. They just didn't feel quite as unique to me as the Nano version of the brown switch. And lastly, we have the blush switches. Upon closer inspection, they actually have Kale's name on the top housing. The other switches in the lineup for the Kick75 either have NuPhy's name on the housing or Gatoron's name on the housing. So I kind of assumed they were all kind of a collaboration between NuPhy and Gatoron, but these silent blush switches seems to be made by Kale. The Nano and the Max versions, as I said earlier, are consistent in the materials as well as the actuation force and the bottom out force, and they also sound similar. Of course, there's a slight pitch difference between the Nano and the Max version of the blush switch because you've got different keycap profiles here. You've got a bigger cavity in the keycap for the high profile version. I honestly like them both. If you like a silent switch or plan to use the Kick75 in a shared space and you want to keep that volume down, these are a nice option in either low or high profile. They both feel smooth. They don't have that scratchy feel that sometimes silent switches do. And I actually thought that the actuation force of 42 grams was gonna feel kind of light to me, but it doesn't really. These feel nice and snappy. I really enjoy the low profile Nanos. Are probably some of my favorite low profile switches I have tested recently. I did find one small downside with the Blush Max switches, and that was that they had a little bit more wobble than the red and the brown Max switches. It's not horrible, but it was a little more. Now, wobble was no problem at all on the low profile version. Okay, so let's wrap this up with my overall thoughts on the Kick75 now that I've tested the NuPhy IO version and the QMK version and most of the switch options. When it comes to deciding which firmware version to get, well, I actually still feel the same as I did before I even tested the NuPhy IO version. The IO version is just more user-friendly than the QMK version for someone who doesn't have experience with QMK or with VIA. And if you're not interested in learning any of that at all, and you're just looking for the ability to do some customizing, then the NuPhy IO version is a great option. That doesn't mean having the QMK option is bad or unnecessary. If you really want QMK firmware, chances are you know that before buying the keyboard. The only real downside with the QMK version is not being able to change the function of the knob. Now, when it comes to general pros and cons for the Kick75, of course, I did a full rundown of that in my earlier review video, so I'm not gonna rehash everything, but overall, I do really like the combination of features that we have here at this price point. I've had no issues with the wireless connections on either version so far. The typing feel and the sound I think is great right out of the box. It really doesn't require any tinkering. And you've got some sort of add-on options here that some people will think are cool, but they are totally optional. And that includes the ability to buy a conversion kit and swap it between low and high profile, as well as they've made some files available for 3D printing, including some of the accent pieces and things, but these come pre-assembled and you don't have to do any of that if you don't want to. So ultimately, it still just comes down to the design, really. That's the most divisive aspect of the Kick75. It's not a traditional keyboard design with the translucent top here and the retro game style accents, and some people just won't be interested in it because of the design, and that's fine. As always, design preferences are a personal choice, but I can say in all the objective aspects of the Kick75, I'm still confident in saying that if you like the design, it is worth a look because it is a great combination of features and typing feel and sound for this price. So that's it for my last video on the Kick75. Or is it? Well, that's it for now. See you next time.